Hello and welcome. This is Microsoft Flight Simulator and this is the Phoenix Airbus A320. And today I would like to talk to you about a topic that has been requested in the comments section, and that topic is descent planning. Now, descent planning is actually a lot more difficult than most people realize. In the sim you have the advantage that you simply select a runway and a star, and that's what you fly, and you just do everything in managed and everything is good. In the real world this is actually very rarely the case. We do have a star in the flight plan, and of course we know the runway, but we have no idea how we actually gonna get to the runway. Very often there's a lot of traffic, so ATC will actually take us off the star and give us some radar vectors. Sometimes there's not so much traffic and we get huge shortcuts that cut the entire arrival route down from, let's say, 80 nautical miles to 40 nautical miles, and all of a sudden you are several thousand feet too high. So all these things play out in the real world. Like I said in one of my other videos, I've never flown online. Maybe it's the same there, that if you fly on VATSIM or something, that the air traffic controller will give you a shortcut and then you end up being too high. So we'll discuss all of this today in this video. I'm going to show you how we perform descent planning in the real aircraft to keep an eye on our performance, on the energy management, and to ensure that we have a nice and stable approach. Okay, let's get started. Okay, as you can see, we're approaching top of descent. There's a disco here that's on purpose because I want to simulate that we have some kind of radar vectors. So there's probably not going to be a yo-yo shown by the aircraft to help us out, and we cannot use a managed descent. We're flying into Barcelona airport, in case you're wondering. So one of the things you can do, and this is what we always do in the real world, you put in your arrival runway here in the progress page. For us, as you can see here, it's going to be 25 right, so we put in 25 right. And the reason why we do this is because it gives us a distance to the threshold. Some pilots prefer to put in the final approach fix. Of course, that's also an option. Personally, I just prefer the runway. I'm going to show you why a little bit later. So now we know we have a distance to the runway of 86 nautical miles. You may have heard of the formula that you take your first two digits of the flight level, multiply them by 3, and that's the distance you need to descend. You then add another 10 nautical miles because you also need to slow down. On the Airbus you don't actually need to do this because you have this. We've actually discussed this already in one other video. Meters is pretty much, it works out pretty much the same as if you multiply this by 3. So this is the distance we have, and this is the distance we need. So we have 80 miles, around about that. And to get down to the ground we need about, well, it says 45, but we add 10, so 55. So at the moment there's no need to descend. We still have quite a while to go. So this is a quick way of cross-checking where you are on the profile. Now the problem is, this is obviously not showing you your actual distance to the runway. How do you know how far away you are from the actual runway? Well, the honest answer is a lot of that is essentially experience. As you fly more and more often into different airports, you get a feel of what ATC is doing. You listen to the radio. If there's lots and lots of aircraft on the same frequency, you know it's not going to be a short approach. So these are all things that come together. But here in the sim, this is how I would do it. This is what we have. This is what we need. So for the moment we're good, but now ATC is telling us to start to descend, and they're going to give us a heading of, let's say, 335. So we are descending to 10,000 feet, and now you're presented with different options. Of course, if you just fly a star, you're not planning to change anything from the flight plan, then just use managed descent by pushing in here, and the aircraft will just take care of everything. Restrictions in terms of altitude and speed, and you don't have to do anything. And we do this in the real world, especially at complicated airports like Nice or something like that. Even London Heathrow, where there's a lot of traffic, this is a very good tool. Today we don't have that tool available because we are on radar vectors, so we need to make it up ourselves. For me, the golden rule is very simple. If I feel like we are a bit high, which is what we're now, I just use vertical speed. There we are. And dial in something that seems to make sense. So here this arrow will tell you where we'll be at flight level 100. In my opinion, that's a bit too early. So let's put that to 1000 feet per minute. If you think you are too high, then the best thing to do is to go for open descent, just pulling this. And if you still think you're very high, then simply select the speed and increase it. And that will increase your rate of descent and will help with you descending quicker. So for the time being, I think we are a bit high on the profile. There's no need to descend rapidly. We want to make this a nice and efficient approach. So for the time being, it's just a nice gentle approach down to flight level 100. Okay, so we're now going to talk about another aspect of descent planning. So we have reached flight level 100. We're still doing 270 knots. And ATC has just informed us that we're gonna have to be holding this altitude for a while due to departing traffic. So aircraft are taking off here, they're turning towards us, and they're gonna pass underneath us. So for the time being, we will have to stay here. They may even tell you for how many miles or for how many minutes. So that already tells me that we're gonna end up being high, because we're at 10,000 feet, we are getting closer and closer to the runway. So one thing you can do to think ahead is to reduce the speed. So I would go back to something maybe like 230 knots, maybe even 220. At some airspaces you need to first clarify this with ATC. Most of the time you don't. After all, you're the pilot, you need to manage the energy of the aircraft. And the reason why we're doing is because the energy that we are now reducing here in terms of speed, we can then convert into altitude. So what that means is at 10,000 feet, as you probably know, below 10,000 feet you're not allowed to fly faster than 250 knots. So we reduce now the speed to 220, and when we finally get to descent, we go into open descent, and then we turn the speed here to 250, which means the aircraft can descend at least until it has 250 knots really quickly, and gives us a bit of an advantage in terms of energy management. Another thing, so as you can see here, we'll be approaching the runway from the opposite side. The plan is that we're gonna turn right here at some point, fly downwind, and then join the ILS. So this is actually quite good, because for descent planning the general rule is abeam the runway, make sure you're somewhere around about 6,000 maybe 7,000 feet above the runway. And in terms of distance, because if you look here, this distance now makes no sense whatsoever, because it tells us we are 38 miles away from the runway, but this is measuring from the aircraft directly to the threshold. This is not what we'll be flying. So in terms of distance, what you can calculate is that you're gonna be flying 10 miles outbound and 10 miles back inbound. That is usually what happens. And those two rules together can help you to create a better picture. So the aircraft tells us we're about 30, let's call it 35 miles away from the threshold. We add another 20 miles because we're gonna need 10 outbound, 10 inbound. So let's call it 55 nautical miles to the runway, and here it says we're gonna need 30. We don't need to slow down anymore, so we're still very good in terms of profile. Okay, so we are now abeam the runway. As you can see, we are still at 10,000 feet. So as I told you earlier, this means we are now definitely too high. We can cross-check this here. It says here distance to the runway is 7 nautical miles. We add the 10 outbound, 10 inbound. That means we are 27 miles away from touchdown, and it says here that we need a minimum of 30 miles to flight at approach. So we are going to be a bit high. So the best way to do this, if ATC is now saying okay, descend and maintain, let's say 5,000 feet, one thing you can always do, I told you this in another video, is switch on the landing lights. You have to do that anyway once you go below 10,000 feet. The landing lights on the CEOs actually fold out and cause a bit of drag, and will give you an extra 100 feet per minute descent rate. So we're now dialing in 5,000 feet. We go into open descent, and we are below the speed limit of 250. We are flying 220, so we'll increase the speed to 250, and as you can see, this will greatly increase the rate of descent. Okay, as we are now on the approach side of the ILS, another indicator for us is of course the ILS itself. So we can see here very clearly that we are too high. ATC now tells us descend 3,000 feet. So that tells us that very shortly they are going to turn us in for the ILS. We're still high. We cannot fly any faster. We are still in open descent. So at this point I would use the speed brakes. So we deploy them. You can deploy them full if you want, but like I explained in another video, on the A320 series, as long as the autopilot is on, they will only deploy half deflection. So if you're really desperate, you could now switch off the autopilot, then you get the full speed brakes, and then maybe put the autopilot back on should you want to. For the time being, I'm quite happy with this. We are 13 miles away from the ILS. We're at 6,000 feet. We're just passing the altitude here to switch over, transition altitude, so we'll do that quickly. And yeah, we are going down to 3,000 feet. Now they tell us turn left, I don't know, let's say heading 0, no, let's say heading 330 for the time being. So they are already turning us in for the ILS. It's okay because the glide slope is coming in, but we're still pretty quick, so we need to slow down. The way to do this, at least this is how I always do it, is I wait till I am 1,000 feet above the altitude where I should be. I remain in open descent, and then as we approach 1,000 feet, which is 4,000 feet, I'll start reducing. So I want to go back to, let's call it 210 for now. And what that will do, it will reduce the rate of descent to about 1,000 feet per minute, and it will keep the engines in idle. It's actually the most efficient way to descend. We're now below VFE next, so flaps 1. And now they tell us turn left heading, let's call it 290, and we are cleared for the ILS. So we arm the ILS. Glide slope blue, log blue, cap 3 dual, autopilot 1 and 2. I usually fly 210 knots till 12 miles, then I slow down to 180. I keep that speed till around about 9 miles, and then I slow down to 160. I'll keep that speed till around about 5 miles, and then I'll go to final approach speed. And that usually works out quite nice. At 6 miles I usually put the gear down, and then on a nice calm day that usually works out quite alright. Okay, we are passing 12 nautical miles. For me that's the trigger to put in a new speed. We are quite heavy, so let's go down to 180 and wait till we are below VFE next so that we don't get into the overspeed. So that looks good. And flaps 2. So I made the aircraft purposely heavy, so it's not gonna slow down. So at this point I'm already dialing in the 160, because now we have glide slope star. We're gonna start descending, and at least in the real world the aircraft would now stop slowing down because it's just too heavy. the A320 is quite a slippery aircraft, and it would just usually sit around 170 knots. So as you can see, it's gonna stop now, slowing down, and it's gonna go down the ILS nicely. Okay, we are approaching 6 miles. As you can see, we have a headwind that slows down our ground speed, so there's no stress. 6 miles is absolutely fine, so gear down. If you have a lot of tailwind during the approach, it might be worth putting the gear down a bit earlier, because your ground speed is going to be quite high, just to do a bit of extra energy management. So if we would now have a tailwind of, I don't know, 20-30 knots, which is not that unusual at this altitude sometimes, then I would definitely slow down already to final approach speed. So we can do that now. Speed is managed, flaps 3 and flaps full, and this will induce a lot of drag, and the aircraft will now slow down to the final approach speed. Like I said, in these wind conditions this works really well. If you have a lot of tailwind, it might be worth doing it all a bit sooner, just to make sure you're nice and stable at 1000 feet. Okay, we are on short funnels. I'll switch off the autopilot, and I'll also switch off the auto thrust today. So you set the thrust levers to around about 50%. That usually works out quite nicely. I'm not sure why the aircraft has just given a lot of thrust, so we're coming in a bit hot and high. Let's see if we can correct that. Do not descend more than 1000 feet per minute at this altitude. Land, so we're getting back on the glide. We add a bit of thrust. We're heavy, so let's give it 52, something like that, 52% and 1. 200. Here we are. Still confused why sometimes the glide path does not match the puppies. That shouldn't be happening, but anyway.
50, 40, 30, 20, retard.
Whoops, okay.
10, 5.
And here we are. Spoilers. Reverse green. Decel. Okay, we've stopped on the runway. If we just do a quick summary. So as I said before, make use of the progress page. It's very useful. It gives you good indication of your distance to the threshold. Make sure you are aware that this is a direct distance to the threshold. It's not necessarily what you're going to fly. If you're going to be flying past the airport and turning around, add 20 nautical miles to the whole thing. Beam the runway. Make sure that you are around about 6,000-7,000 feet above the runway. That usually works out quite well. In terms of how far you have to go, you compare this to this in meters. So this is what you have, and this is what you need. Above 10,000 feet, please add 10 nautical miles to slow down. Below that, you can basically compare the two almost one by one. Of course, you still need to slow down a little bit more, but it's usually not a huge factor anymore. If you're too high, use vertical speed, go down at a nice 1000 feet per minute. ATC expects usually a minimum of 1000 feet per minute, so don't go way below that. That could annoy them a bit in terms of their planning. If you're too high, use open descent and use the speed to regulate your descent rate. If you're on profile and you have an entire star programmed in and you're planning to fly the whole thing, by all means use manage descent. Not a problem, it usually works out really well. And those are essentially all the tools you have at your disposal to get a good descent planning going. One last thing maybe that we haven't really talked about too much, and that is wind. Winds can be very strong. Take them into account. If you have a lot of tailwind, be a bit more conservative, because it will blow you to the runway very quickly. And if you have a lot of headwind, there's nothing wrong with doing everything a little bit later, especially if a huge headwind. We have that sometimes, I don't know, 40 knots headwind at 3000 feet. Your ground speed is something silly like 100 knots, 90 knots. It's almost like the speed of a GA aircraft. There's no point in putting the gear down 8 miles out, because you're just going to be flying forever and ever with the gear down, burning a lot of fuel. So these are things you need to take into account, especially at higher altitudes. Winds can be quite strong. Just make sure you make yourself aware of that. But apart from that, that's essentially it. It takes a bit of practice, it takes a bit of getting used to. I have to admit, at the beginning when I started flying the bus, it was a bit tricky for me, but by now I think I've developed a good feel for what I can expect, where I want to be, and usually it works out really nice. And like I said, if you really mess it up, open descent, put the speed up if you can, and then there's always the speed brakes. Some people are very reluctant to use them, but I mean, this is what they're here for. This is exactly what they're here for, so make use of them. And that's essentially it. So I hope I was able to answer this question about descent planning and a bit of energy management. I hope you found it useful, and yeah, I would be very happy and look forward to seeing you in the next one. Until then, all the best. Bye bye.